Let's go get some information at the Thieves Guild, says one of your players around the table. And you're sitting there wondering, when did your city spawn a Thieves Guild? Clandestine criminal organizations are such a staple of all kinds of fiction, but definitely fantasy. They range from your Thieves Guild to your Assassin's Brotherhood to your smugglers, even mercenary companies. But are they real? That's a complicated question. A much easier one is, are they useful? And the answer to that is overwhelmingly yes, even if it's just to give your players a place to go for information. So, today we're going to talk about the historical inspiration for all of these types of criminal organizations. But more importantly, we'll also talk about how other authors have used them and the kind of storytelling that these underground organizations support. Welcome to another episode of Worldbuilding Blueprints with your host, Marie Mullaney. We'll start with the historical overview. Now, Thieves Guilds as such are a literary invention. The Spanish author Miguel de Cervantes solidified them in the 17th century, and the American author Fritz Leiber took that idea and ran to the moon with it in his 1943 short story Thieves' House. However, if we look broader than the putative Thieves Guild and instead look for organized crime as in institutions of criminals, well, that concept goes back a long way. How long? For the first mention, I need to take you back to the 20th dynasty of Egypt. That's right, we have surviving judicial papyri that detail what certainly looks like organized crime. This organization robbed the tombs of ancient Egypt. I swear I'm not making this up. It's all written down in the Abbot and Mayer papyri. During the New Kingdom period of ancient Egypt, Pawera, alternative spelling Peweru, was the mayor of Western Thebes. At this time, there was a series of tomb robberies that occurred in the Valley of Kings. Because of course there were. The mayor of Eastern Thebes was Pacer, and that will be important, so remember that name. In the tomb robbery report of year 16 of Ramses IX, Pacer accused Pawera of, at the very least, being negligent in his duties in protecting the royal tombs from robbers. There might also be at least the implication that Pawera himself might have been involved with the tomb robbing malarkey. The vizier, Khayyam Waset, of course it was the vizier, who else would it be, ordered an investigation by a commission into these tomb robberies. But here's the kicker. Pawera himself was the head of the commission. Again, I kid you not. Apparently, the people of Deir el-Medina considered this investigation to be corrupt, and genuinely, I think they had a point. The investigation was followed by a trial which found 17 workmen from nearby temples guilty of tomb robbing, and they were executed, which smells of scapegoating to me. Pawera, of course, was never charged. He continued to serve in office. And what happened to the whistleblower Pacer? Well, he vanished from history. The robberies continued. So I think we can say with some confidence that organized criminal activities, including bribery, corruption, robbery, and oaths of secrecy, go back a long way. Crime continued to evolve right alongside our growing urbanization as a species. One of the earliest mafia-equivalent organizations comes to us from the Roman Republic, which is sort of poetic. The urban gangs of ancient Rome can be split into three broad categories. The collegia, originally legally neighborhood trade unions and burial societies, many morphed into violent territorial street gangs. The rackets, which were syndicates, like the historical basis for the Aventine Collegium, which ran city-wide protection rackets, extortion rings, illegal gambling, and black market prostitution. And political muscle. Roman politicians like Publius Claudius Pulcher weaponized these criminal organizations, using them to violently intimidate voters, extort rivals, and trigger riots. Because of course they did. Over in China, the Red Eyebrows and the Green Woods started out as peasant defense networks and rebellions, but eventually morphed into large-scale, structured insurgent criminal syndicates. I swear, no good deed goes unpunished. Eventually, in the 17th century, we get the birth of the triads, the Tian Dihu. They originated as patriotic secret societies formed to overthrow the ruling Manchu Qing dynasty. Over time, their political goals faded and the tightly knit, strictly hierarchical brotherhoods morphed into a criminal network. Because we can't have nice things. Coming back a little bit more to the west, India was home to one of the most feared and deeply entrenched highway syndicates in human history, the Thugee. And yes, that's the origin of the word thug. The earliest record of the Thugee is from 1356 CE in the history of Firuz Shah. They operated in tightly structured mobile units called burototes, and they used neither firearms nor knives, which would spill blood and attract attention. Instead, they would integrate themselves as friendly travelers into wealthy caravans, build trust over days, and then systematically strangle the victims from behind using a specialized yellow scarf called a rumal, which is just charming. The Thugee were an entirely hereditary, multi-generational criminal trade passed down from father to son. Uniquely, the syndicates crossed deep religious divides, seamlessly integrating both Muslim and Hindu members. And while they frequently invoked the goddess Kali to justify their lifestyle as a preordained destiny, today we view them primarily as a sprawling, highly specialized economic cartel that exploited the lawless gaps between major Indian kingdoms. In other words, a criminal organization. But speaking of medieval organizations, we absolutely have to talk about the origin of the word assassins. The Order of Assassins, the Nizara Ismailis, founded in 1090 by Hassan-i Sabah, represents the ultimate historical archetype for the fiction's Assassins Guild, a secretive elite group specializing in surgical political executions. Based out of a formidable mountain fortress in Persia and Syria, the Assassins were a highly structured organization divided into rigid classes based on initiation levels. They employed meticulous psychological tactics, often killing targets in highly public spaces, like crowded mosques, to maximize the psychological impact and cultivate absolute fear. Members swore oaths of loyalty and secrecy to the point of undertaking suicide missions, ensuring operational security and resilience. Their reputation was built on their terrifying ability to infiltrate heavily guarded targets using both violence and subtle psychological intimidation, like leaving a legendary dagger on an enemy's pillow while they slept, just to show they could have killed them. Their activities were deeply intertwined with religious and political motivations, aiming to protect their sect against overwhelming enemies. And it's not all legendary. The Assassins nearly rid the world of King Edward Longshanks when he was just Prince Edward and on crusade. In June 1272, during the Ninth Crusade, he was staying in Acre. An assassin posing as a messenger of the Emir Ramla gained access to Edward's private quarters while the prince was resting. The assassin stabbed Edward with a poisoned knife. Though severely wounded in the arm, Edward managed to fight off the assailant, overpower him, and kill him. Edward's wounds began to fester due to the poison, and his life was only saved when a surgeon cut away the infected flesh. Now, that attempt failed, but the fact that the assassin came so close to killing a prince sent shivers down everyone's spine, and certainly expanded the reputation and prestige of the assassins. Here's an interesting world-building tidbit for you. In pop culture properties like the Assassin's Creed, the Templars and the Assassins are depicted as eternal, lifetime enemies. And this is sort of true, but the real history is far more complex. In the real-world Middle Ages, the Assassins and the Knight Templars were bitter military and religious rivals, but sometimes they shared a common enemy or two. So, while they frequently fought each other over territory and political influence, they also engaged in periods of real diplomacy, truces, and mutual black market agreements, depending on who they needed to deal with at that time. And speaking of the Templars, let's return to Europe. At the end of the 100 Years' War, tens of thousands of mercenaries suddenly found themselves without work. And of course, they turned to crime. A very organized crime that is probably the closest thing to a historical thieves' guild that we have. Following the Treaty of Arras and the winding down of the 100 Years' War, roaming bands of demobilized mercenaries, deserting soldiers, and rootless vagabonds, collectively known as écureuils or skinners, began terrorizing the French countryside. Out of this chaos emerged the coquelards, or the Compagnons de la Coquille, a massive, highly organized criminal fraternity that operated heavily in northern France and Burgundy. The name, by the way, can be loosely translated into the Children of the Shell, which is just chef's kiss for a criminal name. Unlike a random assortment of chaotic street thugs, no shade to the thuggee, the coquelards operated like a dark mirror of a legitimate trade guild. They had their own strict hand signs and a complex criminal slang jargon, which kept their communications completely opaque to outsiders and local law enforcement. Their ranks didn't just include simple jobless mercs, they absorbed rogue clerics, crooked merchants, corrupt lawyers, and even the famous French poet François Villon. In 1455, the authorities finally caught a break. A major trial was held in Dijon after a dozen suspects were rounded up in a local brothel, which is amazing. It's always your dick that gets you into trouble. Thanks to meticulous judicial records that survived the era, we know the sheer scale of their operation. They ran massive protection rackets, produced sophisticated counterfeit money, operated complex gambling scans using loaded dice, and carried out coordinated military-style armed robberies on highways and local estates. What makes them truly feel like a fantasy fiction guild was their adherence to a strict code of silence. During the Dijon trials, prosecutors noted that despite intense interrogation and the threat of brutal torture, the core secrets and leadership structure of the organization remained remarkably intact because members were bound by oaths of absolute loyalty. They had turned the desperate survival of post-war mercenaries into a highly structured corporate criminal ecosystem. Moving forward into the 18th century, urbanization exploded, and with it came a brand new evolution of the criminal underworld, the corporate crime executive. Enter Jonathan Wild, the self-proclaimed thief-taker general of the 17th and 18th century London. Wild treated crime like a highly efficient corporate enterprise, and boy did he make that work for him. He operated a brilliant double-cross system. On the surface, he was London's most famous private detective, running a legitimate office where citizens could pay for him to recover their stolen property. In reality, Wilde was the mastermind behind the very gangs committing the thefts. He controlled highly organized rings, yes, multiples, of pickpockets, burglars, and highwaymen. If a thief stole a gold watch, they brought it to Wilde. Wilde would then discover it, return it to the wealthy owner for a massive reward, pay the thief a small cut, and pocket the rest. If any thief tried to operate independently or rebel against him, Wilde simply used his legal authority to arrest them, present evidence to the courts, and have them publicly hanged. It was basically the perfect setup. He was eventually exposed and executed at Tyburn in 1725, but his legacy as an organized crime boss who wrapped himself in legitimacy of the law remains one of history's greatest blueprints for a world builder creating corruption. As the world crossed into the 19th and 20th centuries, waves of mass migration to and rapid industrialization in the United States created the perfect breeding ground for the most famous criminal networks in our history, including the Mafia. Originating in the lawless feudal orange groves of 19th century Sicily, the Cosa Nostra began as localized private protection enforcement for wealthy landowners. However, as millions of Italian immigrants fled poverty and fascism for the United States at the turn of the 20th century, the Mafia crossed the Atlantic. In the crowded neighborhoods of New York and New Orleans, these tight-knit ritualistic families adapted their Sicilian codes of omerta, absolute silence, to build a multi-billion-dollar criminal empire on foreign soil. But they didn't arrive to a blank slate of crime-free cities. Long before the Mafia consolidated power, mid-19th century New York City was ruled by vicious, ethnically segregated street gangs like the Bowery Boys and the Dead Rabbits, which again is just great name. Centered in the notorious Five Point slum, these groups were organized political engines. Mirroring the ancient Roman collegia, corrupt political machines like Tammany Hall explicitly hired these gangs to act as muscle, using them to stuff ballot boxes, violently intimidate rival voters, and run local protection rackets. Seriously, if your world doesn't have a protection racket, I want to know how you managed to escape that. It is so ubiquitous. Anyway, of course, none of this crime was helped by prohibition. In 1920, the United States passed the 18th Amendment, making alcohol illegal. It was intended to cure societal ills. Instead, it became the greatest financial windfall organized crime had ever seen. Overnight, a massive, complex black market supply chain for smuggling, or bootlegging, was born. Side note. You cannot create a law that makes most of your citizens criminal. If you do that, you break the societal contract. Once everyone is committing a crime, people start thinking that crime isn't so bad, and you end up with a Chicago outfit. So if you want to create a society that has this aspect of lawlessness, just put in place something like the prohibition, which was a law that could never be fully enforced and turned everyone into a criminal. Nowhere was this crime wave more explosive than in Chicago. Al Capone and the Chicago outfit transformed what had been a loose collection of street-level gamblers and pimps into a highly disciplined, militarized corporate conglomerate. They owned breweries, controlled secret international shipping lanes, and bought off entire police departments and city councils. Capone famously viewed himself not as a criminal, but as a legitimate businessman providing a service the public demanded. And the public did love him, at least a little bit. By the mid-20th century, organized crime had completely shed its image of disorganized street thugs. Again, no insult to the thuggee. They had become corporate, institutional, and entirely embedded in the machinery of the modern state. Ain't life grand? Now, before we move on to fantasy applications, give me one moment to tell you about my latest book, which is currently in its pre-launch phase on Kickstarter. This book is called Blood and Bloom in Las Vegas, and it is an urban fantasy with a magic system based on Ogham staves and world building that marries ancient mythology to our current modern-day world. Lily Harper is a druid and sentinel, a magical peacekeeper tasked with ensuring that the commonkin, that's us, never find out about the fairies living amongst us. To Henderson PD, she's just a quirky botanical consultant with a sharp Boston accent. But in the magical world, she's the only thing standing between a fragile peace and all-out war. And when a murder victim is discovered at Lake Las Vegas, with magical moondrops blooming in his heart, Lily realizes a deadly power has arrived in her city, and much shenanigans ensue. If you like fast-paced urban fantasy stories with a noirish voice and just a dash of queer romance, then Blood and Bloom in Las Vegas is the book for you. Check out the link to the Kickstarter down below. And now, back to the show. Now that we understand the historical context of criminal organizations and institutions, let's talk about how they can serve you in a fantasy world. First, they can be a mirror of society. As we saw with the Coquillards or the Triads, criminal organizations do not appear in a vacuum. They are a direct reflection of your world's systemic failures. If your world has a massive, thriving Thieves Guild, it tells the reader that the official government is either profoundly corrupt, incredibly weak, or completely indifferent to the lower classes. A gang running a protection racket in a city means the local watch is failing to keep people safe. So use your underworld to expose the cracks in your upper world, as we see with smugglers, the Chicago Outfit, and various other criminal organizations that step into the gaps where governments fail or where there are unintended consequences to legislation. A great fantasy example of this is Trudy Canavan's The Black Magician trilogy, where the Thieves Guild functions as a literal shadow government in the city of Imarden. The ruling Magicians Guild is elitist, wealthy, and entirely detached from the squalor of the lower classes. And on behalf of the king, they stage an annual purge to physically throw the poor out of the walled portions of the city. And beyond the walls, there is this dangerous power vacuum where the strong prey on the weak without mercy. And this gave a gap to the thieves. They brought order to crime, keeping predations within check and, importantly, offering protection to businesses. By the time of the books, the Black Magician trilogy books, the thieves are entirely entrenched, and they run massive gangs that control every aspect of criminal life in Imarden, all of it fueled by the continuing indifference of the elites to the daily life of people. In order to create a thieves guild or other criminal organization based on this kind of failure of your state, you need to have a large group of people that the state is actively failing. Out of these oppressed people, you can then create countercultural movements that become more and more criminal, like the Taiandu becoming the Triads, or you can have just straight up criminal organizations like the Coquillards, which formed out of those mercenaries who found themselves out of work at the end of the 100 Years' War. Your second use with thieves' guilds are pragmatic deals, criminal entrenchment, and moral grayness. Sometimes an underworld organization grows so large and entrenched that the state realizes it cannot destroy it. When that happens, the narrative function shifts from violent conflict to a surreal bureaucracy. The organization becomes an unofficial administrative layer of the city's economy, effectively turning crime into a licensed, regulated trade. This kind of thieves' guild also lets you explore a setting based on a fragile geopolitical balance, where the rulers and the criminals have a mutual understanding that keeps the peace right up until your characters break it. In Terry Pratchett's Discworld series, the Ankh-Morpork Thieves Guild represents the ultimate satire of this concept. Under a formal state charter granted by the patrician, Lord Vetinari, crime is managed as a public utility. The guild enforces strict annual theft quotas, offers licensed burglaries, complete with receipts so you don't get robbed twice in the same night, and actively hunts down and eliminates unlicensed street thieves to maintain public order. It turns a chaotic urban nightmare into a predictable, taxable corporate entity. Raymond E. Feist handles this with a slightly darker tone in his Machemia novels, where the mockers operate out of the sewers of Krondor. Ruled by the mysterious upright man, they function as an indispensable shadow monopoly that the crown not only quietly tolerates, but actively works with in some cases to prevent anarchy on the streets of Krondor. However, in my opinion, the best implementation of this kind of thieves' guild comes from Scott Lynch. In the Gentleman Bastard series, the city of Camor is governed by a fragile treaty known as the Secret Peace. Established between the criminal underworld led by Kappa Barsavi and the ruling Duke of Camor, this agreement dictates that the criminal syndicates may run their illicit operations freely, provided they never target the nobility or the state apparatus. This mirrors the historical social contract of the Venetian Republic, where the ruling patricians permitted the lower classes to run various black markets and vice rings to prevent popular rebellions, provided the criminal elements did not challenge the state's absolute political authority. The narrative tension in the Gentleman Bastards novels explodes because Lynch's protagonists, the Gentleman Bastards of the name, are elite con artists specifically raised to target the wealthy nobility, completely shattering that secret peace. In order to create an organization like this, you need to set up an elite class that is willing to bargain with a criminal class, and a criminal class that judges that stealing from the poor will make them rich enough that they don't need to target the rich. So really, in my opinion, this kind of model exists best when you have some kind of a middle class that will keep your criminals wealthy. If the wealth inequality is so great that the poor have nothing to steal, your criminals are unlikely to make deals with the elite since they're not going to make no money targeting the poor. The third use for criminal organizations is generational culture and the triad model. Instead of using the standard medieval guild structure with masters, apprentices, and dues, an underworld organization can function as an alternative society based on blood oaths, deep cultural heritage, and ancestral clan warfare. This shifts the story from a simple cops versus robbers dynamic to a sprawling generational epic about family legacy and honor in the shadows. A great example of this is Fonda Lee's Greenbone saga, where the island of Kekon is dominated by two rival militarized crime syndicates, the Mountain Clan and the No Peak Clan. Drawing heavy inspiration from the esoteric titles, blood oaths, and internal hierarchies of historical Chinese triads, Li constructs a highly realistic corporate and military structure. The clans are split cleanly between a military wing led by the Horn and a business political wing led by the Weatherman, with everyday civilian business owners, the Lantern Men, paying tribute for protection. I'm telling you, it's universal. So, by blending this hyper-realistic triad structure with a soft magic system centered on ability-enhancing jade, Li moves far beyond the classic fantasy trope of a dark alleyway guild, turning organized crime into the literal bedrock of her world's culture and economy. This kind of structure works best when it's grown out of either political chaos or a countercultural organization. The mafia came into being after Sicily was absorbed by Italy and lawlessness hit the orange groves. The triads are the dark children of peasant rebellion organizations. The Thuggi exploited the political chaos between kingdoms in India. The Vori V Zacconi, thieves in law, was an elite fraternity of professional criminals that arose in the Soviet Gulag system. They were built entirely around the principle of non-cooperation and resistance to the Soviet state. Even the assassins were born in this kind of political vacuum, where a small group of Shia Muslims were trying to carve out a safe space in the world for themselves. So, to create a multi-generational organization built on dark loyalty and power, think of the politics that give rise to the organization. Is there a chaotic environment ready for exploitation like the Thuggi or the mafia? Or is there a countercultural organization that is actively resisting an oppressive state and slowly morphs into a criminal organization? Especially if they do manage to change the state, it is very possible. Let me show you what I mean. Let's say your countercultural candle flames manage to secure worker rights for the mole people slaving in the mines. Yay! Mole people unite. Everyone celebrates. But there's a rump of the candle flames left who don't want to return to their normal lives. They enjoyed being the resistance and fighting the state, and now it's all that they're good at. And so the Candle Flame version 2 is born, not as a resistance organization fighting for mole people's rights, but as a criminal organization that controls smuggling out of the mole people mines, or something like that. Okay, so how do you actually build this organization? Besides the internal organization and history and all of those good things that we discussed when we spoke about factions, and you should check out that video in the information card, there are some specific questions that are good to think about in terms of a criminal organization. The first is the types of crime. Crime is a multifaceted beast, especially in fantasy. Magic could be a crime, and you could have off-license mages acting as smugglers. Theft is probably a crime, but how much the authorities care about poor people getting robbed is a different question, and that could give rise to those ever-present protection rackets. Prostitution and gambling might not be crimes in your world and could be freely practiced, and so forth. And then, of course, not all thieves' guilds control all forms of crime. Some might specialize. So you could have a magical thieves' guild specializing in artifacts and stealing from dragons, a very dangerous profession. Others might specialize in actual thievery, or you could have an actual assassins' guild that specializes in removing of political opponents. So consider the type of crime, first, that exists in your society, of course, but also that your guild controls. Second, consider the relationship with authority. Your Thieves Guild might have an understanding with your city's government. They might even have a seat at the table through a corrupt official or just directly at the council of the king. Or they could be complete anathema to your city, like the Vorivi were to the Soviet government. Thirdly, consider the relationship they have with the public. Al Capone really was beloved until he wasn't. The public might view the Thieves Guild as a blessing to help them get around unnecessary laws. Or they could view the Thieves Guild as a necessary evil to control the gap in law enforcement. Or they might be completely against the guild. Or it could be a very complicated relationship where they agree with the Thieves Guild's goals. So if the Thieves Guild is like a countercultural organization, but the public doesn't agree with the means that the Thieves Guild uses to drive towards those goals. And fourthly, consider your themes and story purpose. It is always worth thinking about why you're including a Thieves Guild and what themes you want the guild to play into. Now, not all of it has to be that deep, but if you know up front what you want from the guild, it will guide you in creating a guild that feels like it organically supports your story. And those are my thoughts on Thieves Guilds. Make sure you hit subscribe if you want to be notified about next month's podcast, where we speak about academic guilds and specifically magic guilds. Let me know your favorite Thieves Guild in the comments. Hit the thumbs up button and all those good things. If you want to financially support the podcast, check out that Kickstarter, which is currently in its pre-launch phase, or consider becoming a member of the Just in Time World Building YouTube channel, who make this podcast financially viable. I very much appreciate all of you, and all their names are currently on screen. So thank you to those members who feed my cats every month. And you can join their ranks on YouTube. And I will see you soon for another episode of World Building Blueprints, where we build what we need when we need it.